Ethan Carter had always ruled the school halls with an iron grip, his sharp tongue and cruel pranks making him both feared and admired. To him, power meant control and control meant winning, especially when it came to Marcus Johnson, the one kid Ethan made sure never forgot his place. But when Marcus's father is appointed as the new principal, the balance of power shifts overnight. Suddenly, the boy Ethan tormented for years isn't just another student. He's the son of the man who now runs the school. And when the tables turn, Ethan is forced to face the one thing he's never had to confront before himself. The morning air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, as sunlight stretched lazily over the quiet suburban streets of Montgomery, Georgia. The bell tower of Lincoln High stood tall against the amber sky, a beacon of routine and order. Inside, students shuffled through the bustling hallways, the scent of pencil shavings and cafeteria waffles lingering in the air. In the middle of the crowded hallway, 16-year-old Ethan Carter strutted with a cocky confidence that only the privileged could afford. His piercing blue eyes swept over the students like a self-proclaimed king surveying his kingdom. His group of friends, Connor, Jake, and Mason, trailed behind him, laughing at every joke he made, every insult he threw. And then, there was Marcus Johnson. Marcus walked with quiet dignity, his tall frame moving with an effortless grace. His deep brown skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, and his neatly twisted locks framed a face both intelligent and kind. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best armor. The son of an English professor and a civil rights attorney, Marcus had been taught resilience from the cradle. He knew the weight of his skin in a town where history still whispered through the cracks in the pavement. Ethan had made Marcus his personal target since middle school. The taunts, the slurs, the shoves in the hallway, they were relentless. It wasn't just Ethan's words. It was the way he said them, the way his friends laughed, the way teachers conveniently looked the other way. Today was no different. As Marcus reached for his locker, Ethan's shoulder slammed into him, sending his books cascading to the floor. "Watch it, Johnson," Ethan sneered, his lips curling into a smirk. "Or should I say, watch your place." Laughter erupted behind him. Marcus clenched his jaw but said nothing. He bent down, collecting his books as whispers spread around them. Some students glanced away, unwilling to get involved. Others watched, wide-eyed, waiting for the reaction that never came. What none of them knew, what even Marcus himself didn't know, was that life had a way of shifting power in the most unexpected ways. And years later, when the halls of Lincoln High saw a new leader walk through its doors, Ethan Carter would be the one frozen in place. And he wouldn't be laughing. Marcus adjusted the strap of his backpack and kept his eyes forward as he walked away from Ethan's smirking face. He had long since learned that engaging with him was pointless. Ethan thrived on control, on knowing that his words had power. But Marcus wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Still, his hands shook as he shoved his books into his locker. He hated the way Ethan and his friends made him feel, as if every step he took at Lincoln High was under a spotlight, every breath he took was an invitation for judgment. But then, something happened that neither of them saw coming. At lunch, the entire school buzzed with an unexpected announcement. Principal Richardson, a strict but fair man, had suddenly resigned. Rumors swirled through the cafeteria like wildfire. Some said he had taken a better position in another district, while others whispered about a scandal that had forced him out. Ethan sat at his usual table, feet kicked up on the bench, tossing a football between his hands as he laughed with his friends. "Man, this school's gonna be even worse now," Connor muttered, shoving a handful of fries into his mouth. Jake nodded. "I heard they're bringing in some diversity hire. You already know what that means. Extra credit for people like him." He flicked his eyes toward Marcus, who sat a few tables away, quietly reading a book. Ethan smirked but said nothing. The idea of change didn't sit well with him. He liked knowing the rules, knowing who stood where in the social hierarchy of Lincoln High. Then the intercom crackled to life. "Students, may I have your attention, please?" It was Mrs. Caldwell, the school secretary, her voice warm yet formal. "We are pleased to announce that our new principal will be joining us next week. He is an esteemed educator and an alumni of Lincoln High. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Marcus Johnson as the new principal of our school. The cafeteria fell into a stunned silence. Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs. His father, the realization hit him like a tidal wave. His father had always spoken about the importance of change, about stepping into roles where black voices needed to be heard. But he hadn't said a word about this. Across the room, Ethan's smirk vanished. His fingers tightened around the football, knuckles turning white as he processed what he had just heard. He knew the name. He had spent years sneering it at Marcus, throwing it around like an insult. And now that name belonged to the most powerful man in the school. A strange, suffocating feeling curled in Ethan's stomach. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just disbelief. For the first time in his life, Ethan Carter felt something unfamiliar. Fear. The days that followed the announcement were a blur of whispers, sideways glances, and silent tension that filled the halls of Lincoln High like an unspoken storm. Ethan tried to act like he didn't care, like it didn't matter that the father of the guy he had tormented for years was now the man in charge. But deep down it gnawed at him. He avoided looking at Marcus in the hallways, but it didn't help. The knowledge sat heavy on his chest, pressing down harder with every step he took through the school. Then Monday arrived. The day Dr. Marcus Johnson walked through the doors of Lincoln High as its new principal. Ethan sat in homeroom, bouncing his knee anxiously under his desk, waiting for the inevitable. And then, right on cue, the intercom crackled. "Good morning, students. This is Dr. Johnson, your new principal. I want to take a moment to say how honored I am to be here. Lincoln High is a school with a strong history, but also a school with room to grow. My door is always open to those who need it. Let's work together to make this school the best version of itself." His voice was steady, deep, and authoritative. There was no anger, no smugness. Nothing in his tone indicated that he carried a grudge or had any intention of using his power for revenge. And yet, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his world had just shifted in a way he could never undo. That feeling only worsened when Dr. Johnson began making changes. Dress codes became more lenient. New policies were put in place against bullying and discrimination, ones with actual consequences. Teachers who had once turned a blind eye to kids like Ethan were suddenly holding students accountable. It was the first time in Ethan's life that he felt something slipping away. Control. A week later, Ethan found himself walking out of the locker room after football practice, still fuming from an argument with his coach. Ever since Dr. Johnson had stepped in, the school had been softer, according to Ethan. Detentions were actually being handed out for behavior that had once been laughed off. The world wasn't bending to his will anymore, and he hated it. And then, as if the universe was testing him, he spotted Marcus walking toward his father's office. Something inside Ethan snapped. He quickened his pace, catching up to Marcus just before he reached the door. "Hey, Johnson." Marcus stopped but didn't turn. "What do you want, Ethan?" His voice was tired, but not weak. Ethan scoffed. "Funny how things change, huh? Your dad finally gets a little power, and now suddenly, we all have to walk on eggshells." Marcus exhaled through his nose, finally turning to face him. "Power? You think my dad took this job for power?" He shook his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" Ethan took a step closer, sneering. "Oh, I get it. This is your family's big revenge plan, right? Make life hell for guys like me." Marcus's expression didn't change. He studied Ethan in a way that made his skin itch, like he was seeing something in him that Ethan didn't even understand about himself. "Life's already been easy for guys like you, Ethan," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe that's why this feels so unfair to you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Shut up." Marcus didn't. "You don't want to admit it, but you're scared. Not of me. Not even of my dad. You're scared of a world where you don't automatically win. Where you don't get to decide who matters and who doesn't." Ethan's hands curled into fists. He had always been good at talking, at cutting people down with his words. But now, for the first time, he had nothing. Because deep down, he knew Marcus was right. For years, Ethan had lived in a bubble where he could say and do whatever he wanted, and the world would shrug. His dad was a respected businessman in town. His mom was on the school board. He had never once worried about his future. But now, he was being forced to face a version of the world where people like Marcus mattered. And it terrified him. The moment stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then Marcus sighed. You know, you could just stop. Ethan blinked. What? You could stop being this guy. Marcus gestured vaguely at him. Like he was holding up a mirror Ethan refused to look at. You don't have to keep doing this. You don't have to be what people expect you to be. Ethan scoffed. And what, be some kind of good guy? Marcus shrugged. Maybe just be better. Ethan wanted to laugh. Wanted to mock him, to push him, to do something that would put him back in control of this moment. But all he could do was stand there, staring at Marcus, feeling something unfamiliar clawing at his insides. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was. And that scared him more than anything. Dr. Johnson's office door opened, and the man himself stepped out, spotting the two boys standing in silence. Everything all right here? He asked, his gaze flicking between them. Marcus nodded. Yeah, we're good. Ethan hesitated. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he had won or lost. Maybe, for once, it wasn't about that at all. Ethan walked out of the school building that day feeling off. His hands were stuffed deep in his jacket pockets, his jaw tight, his mind a tangled mess of emotions he didn't know how to name. He had always been good at brushing things off, at making himself believe he was untouchable. But this? Marcus's words wouldn't leave him. You could just stop. Maybe just be better. The idea gnawed at him. What if he could change? What if he didn't have to be the guy who laughed at racist jokes, who shoved kids into lockers just to hear his friends cheer? What if, for the first time, he made a choice that wasn't about control, but about something else entirely? The thought sat heavy on his chest. The next morning, Ethan walked into school, fully expecting everything to feel normal again. But it didn't. The world looked different, even though nothing had changed. Or maybe he was the one changing. Lunchtime came, and as usual, Ethan sat with Connor, Jake, and Mason, but something was off. He could hear them talking, laughing about some underclassmen they had pranked earlier, but for once their voices sounded hollow. Dude, you're quiet today, Connor said, nudging him. What? Still pissed about Johnson's dad running the place? Ethan shrugged. Not really. Connor raised an eyebrow. What's up with you? Nothing. Ethan looked down at his food. Then, almost without thinking, he said, maybe we should chill with that stuff. Jake frowned. With what? Ethan hesitated. This was harder than he thought it would be. The whole Johnson thing. The jokes, the shoving. Maybe it's not that funny. Silence. Connor and Jake stared at him like he had grown a second head. Mason chuckled uncomfortably, looking between them. The hell are you talking about? Connor scoffed. I'm just saying, Ethan muttered, shifting in his seat. Maybe it's played out. Connor snorted. Okay. And since when are you soft? Jake smirked. Since his daddy took over? The table laughed. But Ethan didn't. Instead, he pushed his tray forward, appetite gone, and stood up. Forget it. Where are you going? Connor called after him. Ethan didn't answer. He just walked away. Across the cafeteria, Marcus noticed the commotion at Ethan's usual table. He saw the way Ethan stood, the way his own friends laughed at him. It was subtle, but something had shifted. Ethan Carter had always walked through the school like he owned it. Now, for the first time, he looked like someone searching for something. Marcus wasn't sure what to make of it. But he knew one thing. Something had changed. That afternoon, Ethan found himself outside Dr. Johnson's office, standing in the hallway, staring at the closed door. He didn't know why he was there. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. Before he could talk himself out of it, he knocked. Come in, came the deep, steady voice. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped inside. Dr. Johnson looked up from his desk, raising an eyebrow as he saw who it was. He set his pen down, folding his hands in front of him. Ethan Carter. Ethan shifted awkwardly. Hey. Dr. Johnson studied him for a moment before nodding to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." Ethan hesitated, then sat down. The room was quiet for a long time. Finally, Dr. Johnson spoke. "Something on your mind?" Ethan let out a breath. He didn't know how to say what he was thinking. He didn't even know if he wanted to say it. But then, in a voice quieter than he intended, he muttered, "Am I a bad person?" Dr. Johnson didn't react right away. He simply regarded Ethan, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he said, "That depends." Ethan's throat felt tight. "On what?" "On what you do next." Silence. Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't know what that meant yet, but for the first time in his life he was willing to figure it out. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Ethan left Dr. Johnson's office feeling lighter, but not in a way that suggested relief. It was more like stepping into a world that looked the same but no longer felt familiar. His own reflection in the glass windows of the school no longer matched the person he thought he was. For the rest of the week, he didn't bother sitting with Connor and Jake at lunch. He noticed the way they looked at him now, like he had betrayed some unspoken code. Maybe he had. Maybe he should have done it sooner. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself alone. But strangely, that was okay. A few days later, Marcus was at his locker when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Ethan standing there, shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Something you need?" Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Look, I don't know how to do this." Marcus blinked. "Do what?" "This." Ethan gestured vaguely between them. "I don't know how to fix." He stopped himself, shook his head, and looked down. "I don't even know if I can fix it." Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "You don't just fix something like this overnight." Ethan nodded. He figured as much. "But," Marcus continued, closing his locker, "you can start." Ethan swallowed. "How?" Marcus smirked slightly. "Try acting like a decent human being for once." Ethan huffed a laugh, but there wasn't any malice in it. Just exhaustion. "Sounds harder than it looks." "Yeah," Marcus admitted. "It is." The silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't tense. It was something closer to understanding. And for Ethan, maybe that was enough. Over the next few weeks, things began to shift. Ethan still had moments where he caught himself slipping into old habits. An impulse to make a crude joke, an instinct to take control of a conversation with a sneer instead of sincerity. But every time he stopped himself. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. He still wasn't sure what to call what was happening to him. Growth? Change? Maybe both. One day, he passed by a group of freshmen being hassled by some upperclassmen. Normally, he would have ignored it, laughed even. This time, he didn't. "Hey!" he called out, stepping forward. "Back off." The older kids looked at him, confused. Ethan Carter, the same guy who used to be them, was now telling them to stop? The leader of the group scoffed but stepped away. "Whatever, man." They left, muttering under their breath. Ethan turned to the freshmen, who stared at him as if they didn't quite trust it. Thanks?" one of them said hesitantly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, don't let them get to you." He walked away before they could say anything else. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't some big, heroic moment. But it was something. That evening, Marcus sat across from his father at the dinner table, pushing his food around his plate before finally asking, "Do you think people can really change?" Dr. Johnson set down his fork, studying his son thoughtfully. "I think people can change." He smiled knowingly. "The real question is, do they want to?" Marcus thought about Ethan, about the hesitation in his voice, about the way he had tried even when no one was watching. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I think some do." His father smiled. "Then that's enough." Ethan Carter wasn't suddenly a perfect person. He wasn't suddenly free from the past or the damage he had done. But change didn't come in a single moment. Came in choices, small ones, every day. And maybe, just maybe, those choices were enough to start over. To be better. To be more. And maybe that was the lesson all along. Because the world didn't change when one person won and another lost. It changed when people chose to be better than they were yesterday. One step at a time.